Pushkin. Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver. I feel like mixing it up.
All right, Nate Silver. So today on the show, we're actually doing an episode that's inspired by one of our listeners, Brandon. So by the way, listeners, please do keep sending us questions. And Brandon is wondering about performance-enhancing drugs. He specifically asked for performance-enhancing drugs outside of sports, but I think we'll be talking about sports as well. So in the Army, he says that they talk a lot about alertness, decision-making under stress. Caffeine is basically a field-issued stimulant. He goes on to talk about Adderall, modafinil, and the fact that it's being used not just in military, but, college students, professionals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he wants to know, what are our thoughts and what are our experiences? It definitely does say a lot about modern performance culture. So this is a topic that I've done a lot of thinking about, both in the past, but also obviously as I'm working on a book about cheating, I do think about all of these ways to kind of enhance performance that may or may not be legal in any given setting. And I think there's a lot to say here. Do you want me to start with some thoughts, Nate, or do you want to kind of give your reaction?
You go ahead, Maria.
All right.
You drive here.
So, people have been trying to figure out for decades, like, how can I think better, right? How can I perform better? How can I run better? How can I do everything just a little bit better? It's kind of a perfect storm with kind of social media and technology and all of these things where we're in a culture that's obsessed with, the culture has always been obsessed with youth, but now we feel like finally, we're in the do not die ever moment, that if I can just live for another 10 years, I'll be close to the moment in time where we can all live forever, or at least greatly expand our life expectancy and our healthy life expectancy. So don't die. And also let's absolutely optimize every single moment of every single day. Cognitive function, physical function. In the case of certain social media influencer gurus who also happen to run big companies that sell supplements, erectile function as measured during the night. We won't be naming names, but I think anyone who's online knows exactly who I'm talking about right now. So how do you basically enhance every single element of existence to the max? And we're seeing things, yes, some of them are pills. Modafinil has been kind of in the mix for a long time. So has Adderall. There are other drugs that have been basically tested for Alzheimer's and that are now also kind of in that conversation. But it's not just drugs, right? It's things like cold plunges, infrared saunas, do this, do that. Like, what can I possibly do to get just like a little bit better? And this is not a monolithic conversation in the sense that there's a big difference, Nate, between like poker players who decide that they're going to microdose before a tournament because they think it's going to make them more creative and find better spots. This does happen, by the way. I'm not just throwing this out in the blue. And like a Lance Armstrong who decides that, everyone's doping in cycling, so I'm going to do it too. And we're going to create this culture where everyone is taking drugs that are explicitly forbidden to enhance their performance, right? So it's a huge spectrum, right? And there's a huge spectrum between the college student who decides to take Adderall, even though they technically don't have ADHD, so that they can finish a paper, which, by the way, Nate, is probably not happening anymore because you have ChatGPT, who's your Adderall, who could just finish the paper for you. So you don't even need to take those supplements. That was, long before, or the investment bankers taking cocaine in the middle of the night to kind of stay up and make sure that they can get their spreadsheets or whatever it is that they're doing done addiction by the morning. And then the wellness gurus who say, well, even though modafinil is a drug that was developed for narcolepsy and sometimes to treat ADHD and may not be the thing that I should be taken to kind of enhance my concentration, even though there's a little bit of data on that. But I'm going to do it just in case because I want to kind of maximize my ability to be the full me. All of these things are different, right? And I have different opinions on the different gradations along the way. And even ones that seem very straightforward, such as, we should not be allowing any performance enhancing drugs in sports. When you start digging down, it ends up that some of them might be like a little bit murkier than you would think, right? I would love to say that I'm just, we shouldn't be doing any of this. But, as listener Brandon points out, caffeine is a great performance enhancing drug, right? So it's not like everyone is living this existence where we're not taking any substances to increase performance. You need to kind of figure out what exactly are you talking about? And I think that this is one of those episodes where there are going to be a lot of shades of gray. I think that it's one of these case-by-case basis where you have to really understand what's the intention here, what are the data here, what is the responsibility here, and what are the rules here.
Yeah, in the poker world, you have an interesting cross-section of a little bit of everything, right? You certainly have some stimulant use, ranging from people who are probably taking Adderall to people who are taking Zins or vaping. You have.
Oh yeah. By the way, let me just interrupt you immediately, just to say, we said caffeine, but nicotine is another huge performance enhancing drug that people take all the time. And Zyn is gaining huge market shares. I see Zyn at the poker tables all the time. Please continue.
Yeah, and in part because those are as weird as smoking cigarettes, right? Which is more disruptive. It's those are kind of more discreet ways to do with it. But yeah, people are taking Adderall. There's varying amounts of drinking. People have different tolerances. I will often have a glass of one or two at dinner of a poker tournament, right? But everyone reacts differently to different things. You know what I mean? And so you have to know kind of your own. I'm not claiming any of this is game theory optimal, right? You have to kind of know your own physiology a little bit, but not as much drinking as you might have seen 20 years ago. I'm always surprised that there are some players who get quite stoned on dinner breaks and stuff like that, or any break, right? We were talking about a well-known player, Maria, the other day, who seemed to be quite stoned and not playing optimally, and you have some of those, but there are some people who are microdosing on different things, and again, I don't know, right? It's also partly a matter of habit, right? For whatever reason, probably done more drugs than you in my life, Maria, right? For whatever reason, I've just never really tried to play poker under the influence of THC, even though I'm not familiar with THC, whereas I have on alcohol. And so it just kind of part of what you're familiar with. The thing about poker, it's also important though, is these are really long sessions, particularly in tournaments, right? So things that sustain energy and focus for a long time, you don't typically see necessarily a lot of cocaine use, to take an extreme example of poker tournaments, because that is a drug where you kind of burn brightly for very quickly and then crash out, right? That won't work if you're playing from noon to midnight in some tournament. I mean, unless you're taking a lot of it, I guess, right?
But Adderall, which is kind of a controlled version of speed, is something. And Ritalin, these are things that are actually incredibly common in the poker world. And they are common not just in the poker world, but in all sorts of professions that require concentration, right? That require people to kind of pay attention for long periods of time. And the funny thing is, so I've actually written about this, and I have kind of dug a little bit deeper into the data with drugs like Adderall. I think this is true of a lot of performance enhancing drugs. When you are taking anything that is off-label, right, which means that it's not prescribed for this exact condition, especially when it's something that is for a cognitive function and meant to counteract something that is kind of a neurological abnormality or something that is kind of not a neurotypical brain. When you put it into a neurotypical brain that doesn't have these issues, you might get some benefits, but also some unintended side effects. So the funny thing, I mean, I think it's funny because I don't do Adderall or Ritalin off-label. The funny thing about it is that there's actually a disconnect when you take these drugs quite often with what you think your work product is and what it actually is, because it does put you into this like laser focus where you think, oh, I'm writing like a brilliant paper or I'm creating this brilliant work product, or if I'm playing poker, I'm, being able to execute all these wonderful creative lines. But it actually really dampens creativity and makes you create things that to you might seem great, but that actually objectively you're working a lot, but your work output is not necessarily what you think it is. And so it's a very funny disconnect between self-perception and actual performance. And so when it comes to cognitive enhancement, that is something that you see. Now, obviously, when it's physical, there's no disconnect between what you think you're doing and how you're doing, because you have an objective measure immediately, right? Am I running faster? Am I cycling faster? Am I able to actually lift more weight, right? When I use steroids, whatever it is. But when it comes to cognitive enhancement, you have these funny things.
Yeah, we talked to Nick Thompson, the author of The Running Ground. Nick is one of the best runners in the world in his age class the other week, right? One of the things about running is that there's not much variation in it, right? You're running a fixed distance. Most people who are runners are running a few routes that they run commonly. There can be a few things. There can be traffic, right? You can other joggers and stuff like that, right? Or wind or weather, right? But like for the most part, it can be a fairly objective benchmark about your kind of overall cardiovascular, et cetera, health that day and your effort level. Whereas in poker, it's extremely noisy. The best poker players might have in the tough field an ROI of plus 10% and a mediocre player on his B game, not the C game, not the F game, but like on the speed game, right, might be minus 10%, right? Plus 10 versus minus 10 over the course of one poker tournament, you don't detect. You need a sample of like hundreds of tournaments to distinguish those. And yeah, I certainly have had, it's kind of a common thing among writers too, to use like things like Adderall. I've certainly been around people who seem to be constantly on Adderall and they're talking a mile a minute and they're kind of hyper, right? And kind of babbling. And, that's not a drug that leaves me with a great impression. But like, again, I'm not going to, my own habits, right? Good and bad. I'm not going to critique anybody. My empirical experience is that one's a bit more noticeable than, than some of the others. Maybe among the drugs that people are kind of using for cognitive enhancement.
Yeah. So just full disclaimer, I've never used any cognitive enhancing pills. And I say pills because I drink a fuck ton of caffeine.
Okay.
Let me just say that. So and I've actually never used nicotine. So I've never, I'm going to come across as kind of this goody two shoes, but I drink and, I'm not doing this for moral reasons or anything. It's just not, I don't think it's right for me. And also I have a lot of allergies and can't stand smoke, but I've never used any nicotine products. I've never smoked cigarettes, no nicotine. By the way, poker players also love nicotine pills, nicotine patches, not just poker players. This is stuff that, people use. They get into the science and they listen to the kind of gurus of how to enhance your performance, peak performance at any given time. And they do stuff like that. So just total disclaimer, I've never used any of those, but I do use caffeine. And when I play poker, I am always drinking green tea. And I specifically drink green tea because I've done the research and I know that green tea has the best kind of way of absorbing L-theanine into your brain, which helps you sustain your attention for longer periods of time. Am I using a performance enhancing drug, Nate? You know what I mean? Like, I realize I'm not trying to practice semantics here. All I'm saying is that we do make choices all the time that try to optimize how we're doing. Today, by the way, no amount of green tea is probably going to make me at absolute peak performance because I didn't get that much sleep. And what we know is the number one cognitive enhancing drug is sleep. Like, nothing else comes even close. So getting proper amounts of sleep is just like, light years ahead of anything else. And so when you do something like that, well, obviously it's not a performance enhancing drug, but it might as well be. So let's just, I guess, put a disclaimer and say, okay, yes, there's things that everyone does, like caffeine, and it might give you a little bit more cognitive power. And then there are other things that people use that are more out there, and we can argue that, well, nicotine is closer to caffeine, or we can argue that it's not. But modafinil definitely kind of on the other side of that. And do you have a prescription, right? Is it something that you are actually using correctly because you need to? Oh, and by the way, if you do have a prescription for it because you need to, is that giving you an unfair advantage? Is it giving you an unfair edge? There are all of these, when we start getting into the ethics of it. Oh, and by the way, poker doesn't ban any sort of substances. So that's another thing here, right?
No, didn't Chamath, which is also in Patilla,
yes,
yeah,
there was
a drug-free.
Yes.
It's like, come on, bro.
Yeah, he proposed a drug-free poker tournament where you'd get tested and you weren't allowed to use anything. I don't know if caffeine was included in that, because if it was, then sorry, Chamath, I'm totally out. But yeah, I do want to say that it's not against the rules in poker to take whatever the fuck you want to take. And to be perfectly honest, I would say, like, if you want to take it, go right ahead, because I actually don't think it gives you that much of an edge, and I think it sometimes might make you play worse.
And we'll be right back after this break. We can put some bounds on this, right? Like, it's not like in poker look, you could make educated guesses about exactly which helpful and or unhelpful substances different players are taking, maybe apart from the really stone players and the really Adderall-y ones, right? It's not necessarily so obvious, right? It's not like there's some class of players that are like 30% better than the rest. And you're like, oh, they're all on this drug X, right? And there are exotic things that are very subtle. Some poker players take beta blockers. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but I think it has the effect of like lowering your heart rate and things like that, which can be helpful to remain calmer maybe when you're under high stress, and or to reduce the appearance of physical tells, right? I remember actually the main event of the World Series, right, where there was a guy I played against on day 2 or day 3, right, sitting right across from him. He just had a thing where like his heart was like literally kind of very visible in his whatever the fuck artery, carotid or something artery, right? Every fuck player knows it. Corroded. And it was the most visible instance of this I'd ever seen. It's the main event. He had a fairly big stack on day 3, whatever it was. And furthermore, so he basically had like a running heart rate monitor for this player at all times, right? Like, furthermore, I quickly deduced that there was a pattern that when he has a good hand, some players actually get more nervous when they're bluffing, right? This guy, when he had a big hand, you start to see boom, 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 boom. It was kind of funny, right? But like, yeah, but the physical tell, if you start having a bunch of predictable involuntary ticks, or if you can suppress those ticks in some ways, but it's not treated as like a PED use in poker is not treated as like some moral panic. Whereas in the other world, I know sports, then than it is, of course.
Yeah, and I think so. Let's actually talk about that a little bit because so I have very, very different perspectives about using all of these drugs, all of these techniques, whatever you want to use when it is allowed versus when it's not allowed. So poker, knock yourself out. If you are an investment banker and you want to Adderall it up or cocaine it up or whatever it is, awesome. Like you do you, right? And if your superiors are happy with your work, awesome. My opinion changes completely when we have explicit rules that say, okay, you cannot take, these performance enhancing drugs, right? When we're talking about cycling, the argument, but everyone's doing it, to me, holds no water, right? I don't fucking care. Like that is, if it's a rule, that means that everyone is cheating. If everyone is cheating, either you call out the cheating, you quit the sport, you do something else. And it's interesting because there, as I've been kind of researching cheating in games, I talked to a baseball player who was roommates with another player who was suspended for using steroids. And
East Coast team or West Coast team? Give us a little.
I'm not gonna say anything else, Nate. You know these sports a little too well. And it was one of these things where this roommate said, like, people were doing it. I just thought it was wrong, so I didn't. And like, I have no regrets about it, even though kind of my roommate ended up having like a much more storied career for a time than I did because like I basically said no. And my career ended. Like I, eventually kind of had to retire but it's not like you're forced to do it. You make choices. So anyway, you can, I don't care if the culture is that everyone is doing it. What I care about is it within the rules or is it not within the rules? And if it's not within the rules and you're doing it, then you're cheating. And if you're trying to figure out ways of doing it without getting caught by using these new drugs that aren't yet detectable on tests, then again, you're cheating and you're cheating in an even more kind of insidious way that is ruining the kind of sportsmanship, right? The playing field for everyone else. And that is kind of ruining the integrity of your sport. And things like, Nate, the enhanced games that were announced like that. I'm like,
what Peter Thiel thing or what?
Yeah. I'm like, what are we even talking about? Like, I guess people, you want to see a lot of people on steroids go, like, to me, that's not even a sport. I'm like, well, what are we even doing here? And I think a lot of athletes felt the same way. So on the one hand, I said there were going to be a lot of shades of gray here. And this seems black and white, but I'm actually going to take a step back and put it back into the shades of gray. So one of my favorite sports stories that I think I've mentioned on this podcast before, but I'm just going to say it again, was this champion Finnish skier whom I've written about in the past, Eero Montiranta. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. I don't speak Finnish, but he won 7 Olympic medals over 4 games, 3 gold medals, 2 silver medals, 2 bronze medals. And at the time, like no one had done anything comparable, right? Like that's insane. If you're thinking about 7 medals over 4 games, like holy shit. And he was accused of doping. And he was tested, and it seemed to confirm that he was doping because the red blood cells in his blood, there were multiple deviations away from the average range. And so he was accused of doping, but then it turned out that he didn't dope. He was actually clean, and he carried a genetic mutation in a receptor that controls the production of red blood cells. And that genetic mutation ran in his family, right? So it turns out that basically his entire family were kind of these mutants that had this red blood cell plant that was just constantly, basically constantly doping their blood. By the way, this is not, if people are listening to this and it's like, woo, can I do this? Please don't, because this mutation also causes polycythemia, which is a disease of red blood cells. And Montirante did have it, but he didn't have any of the negative symptoms. But anyway, so you have this person who was absolutely cleared, right? And he wasn't doping, but he just naturally had this insane advantage. Now, you can look at someone like this and say, well, if he has this mutation and he's basically naturally doping, shouldn't we allow everyone else to kind of dope to the same level? And I don't think that's true, because then, you can start making that argument with all sorts of different things. But that just goes to show that there are so many different variations here. And there's so much about the human body that we don't know. And it's so easy to start making the fairness argument that I think it's an argument that we shouldn't be trying to make, because people are different. And so all we can do is to try to make rules that control to the best of our abilities what substances you can use to enhance your performance versus how you can enhance your performance through your own physical merits and mettle. Because, isn't that the purpose of watching sports and kind of watching competitors, right? That we see what the human body is capable of on its own? We'll be back right after this.
Yeah, look, to some degree, especially in like maybe Olympic type sports, which are sometimes a little bit more linear functions of a particular type of ability in one or two areas, right? I mean, you are selecting for people who are genetic freaks,
genetic
or superheroes.
Yeah.
The other thing where this comes up, just going to mention it once, right, is you'll periodically get athletes who are intersex in some form. It's not really the same thing as trans, right? It's it's how they're born.
They're born, but, chromosomal differences.
But inherently, you have to draw some lines, because we're not going to talk about the gender binary versus spectrum here. But if you're looking for outliers, you're going to find people who are outliers in lots of different ways, and that creates issues. But look, the game theory part of this that we haven't invoked yet is that you do have a prisoner's dilemma when other people are doping, right? So like, in any workplace kind of culture, I mean, the original question comes from like the army, right? What is tolerated versus tacitly encouraged versus not so tacitly encouraged versus, but you also get to a point where like, maybe you're just kind of falling behind in an extremely high performance area if everybody else is doing something you're not. Barry Bonds, I guess the most famous / infamous steroid user in baseball history, was kind of like this fucking Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa guys, they're juicing, right? I was better than them before steroids, alleged. And I'm going to be better than these fucking guys afterwards, so I'm going to take steroids too. And he has like what are still the best offensive seasons in baseball history, and kind of, just this kind of huge nonlinear outlier season, 73 home runs in a year, whatever it was, 600 on base percentage, or very, very high, right? But prisoner's dilemma, if you don't have like, it's the same thing as like ChatGPT being used to cheat in college essays, right? If you don't have good enforcement, then you get in the dilemma where it's like, well, all my classmates are doing this shit, right? So like, why do I have to work 5 times as hard as them and get like a worse grade? And look, I don't know how effective these regimes actually are in different sports. If you told me that, hey, people are using things that are hard to detect, that wouldn't surprise me, right? I think sports have kind of figured out that like, to have a big moral outrage and panic over this isn't necessarily good for business, right? There are still a couple of baseball players that get suspended every year for different types of PEDs, right? It's not quite perceived as the PR thing that it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is kind of considered the whole steroid era. Baseball has this kind of record book that's very sacred, right? People care a lot about the home run record and the batting average record and and everything else, right? Whereas in football, it's a bit less true. Football's more of a team sport. Football a little bit more slaps on the wrist for different types of PED use. Look, you can even, if you want to get funky, you can even say, okay, are you being a bad teammate by not using steroids, right?
Well, no, I mean, I think that the only the way out of this prisoner's dilemma is through external enforcement and penalties, right? Where the benefits in the moment of doping are outweighed by the potential penalties. So, what comes to mind to me right now is Russia in the Olympics, right? Where you had basically an entire delegation doping, including some athletes who didn't realize that they were doping because the coaches just gave them supplements and said, this is the health regime and we're giving these performance enhancing drugs to everyone. Or at least that's the story. And I actually believe it in the sense that I believe that there were athletes who had no idea that they were doping. And then, you strip everyone of the medals, you disqualify them, and then the team can't compete in the Olympics and no one can compete in the Olympics. That's a pretty big disincentive, right? That will tell people, okay, you know what, maybe this is not a good idea because the risks and the penalties we'll have to pay far outweigh the benefit of winning, a gold medal now because we're going to lose that gold medal anyway, and then we're not going to be able to compete going forward. So if you had standards like that across the board, and if you really take the enforcement seriously, then I think that changes behavior because that changes behavioral incentives and that changes the culture from everyone is doing it to, okay, people are not going to be doing it anymore. But you also have to be smart, right? You also have to test correctly and you have to stay on top of this shit, right? You have to have people who are out in the field figuring out what are the latest drugs, what is the cutting edge, what are people using, how do we detect this, so that you don't have situations where cheaters are trying to kind of stay ahead of the system, which also creates very perverse incentives.
Yeah, look, and that you're willing to punish the actual cheaters,
Absolutely.
Yannick Sinner, who is one of the two best men's tennis players in the world, has been accused of doping, taking trace amounts of clostebol. It looks like I'm not a steroid knowledgeable person.
Nate, come on.
SKP, steroid knowledgeable person. But hey, if he's a big draw, maybe you turn the other cheek. I mean, we've seen the poker world has not been great about people who are big names get away with a lot more, right?
Yeah.
With that said, if you look at the whole list of all Major League Baseball players who have been suspended, which is kind of the longest, most consistent regime, there definitely are some all-stars, right? However, it has moved more toward the more marginal players because, if you're 10% better, I mean, it's also an open question kind of how much this actually helps, right? But leaving that aside, if you get 10% better and you're already pretty good, I mean, that definitely produces benefits, right?
Absolutely.
But you probably already have all the money you'll need for life. I mean, baseball's a sport that has long careers. If you are taking kind of long-term risks with your health, right? I mean, some of these anabolic steroids are not thought to be good for your long-term health, right? They may help in the short run, right?
Yep.
If you're on the margins of the major leagues and you get in a major league roster where what's the minimum salary? I'm sure, if mid six figures now at least, right? You get that for a couple of years, you get a major league pension, you get your first post-draft team contract. I'm going to avoid more technical baseball terms for audience may not know them, right? But if you get a real free agent contract.
And by your audience, you mean your co-host, Nate?
my co-host, yeah. So it's the more marginal guys who are trying to extend their careers, right? Because 10% better when there's a whole threshold in anything, whole threshold of talent near the break-even line. Either just good enough to make the major leagues, or just good enough to have a regular starting job, or just not good enough, right? Mm-hmm. And those are the people where there's the most pressure, even though it's the Barry Bonds and the Yannick Sinners and so forth of the world that receive more public scrutiny.
Yeah, so I think kind of to sum up, I think we both agree that if we want to keep it clean, first of all, performance enhancing drugs, yay or nay, in things where where people don't care, like poker, whatever, you once again, because we don't even know what benefits necessarily are coming from any of these things. In areas where there are explicit rules against them, right, like sports, then absolutely not. And I don't think there should be exceptions. And I think that, big names need to get just as much need to be penalized just as much as smaller names. To bring it back to poker, this means that, things that are illegal, like cheating of different sorts, which are not cognitive drugs or anything like that, needs to be like very strictly punished, no matter who you are, even if you're kind of the number one name in the game. I don't care. You need to realize that there are going to be very strict penalties against these sorts of behaviors. And that's the way that you kind of emerge from the prisoner's dilemma that you were describing, Nate. So we've got areas like poker where it's legal. You've got areas like sports where it's not. Then you've got areas like the Army where presumably they're doing their research and they want people to function as well as they possibly can. And that's its own, that's its own beast, right? Yeah, sure. If you think that this is going to create better soldiers and the soldiers are okay with it, then by all means, right? Like we want the best functioning force. And there, your analogy of, are you hurting the team if you don't do it? Well, are you hurting the team if you're in the Army where the other country has people using this and you aren't? Yeah, you kind of are. And so that's its own different can of worms, right? That's a totally different area. But I would say that, please do try to figure out whether you're mortgaging your health in the long term, because I think a lot of people don't realize that there is a long-term cost to a lot of these performance-enhancing drugs.
Yeah, look, my general thing is assume that in competitive industries, which basically everything is now in our capitalistic world. Not that I don't like capitalism, Maria. I do. But assume that people will optimize for their incentives, right? Yep. If you create rules that are easy to work around or are poorly structured, and there's a lot of money or fame or championships to win on the line, assume that some substantial fraction of your player population in a sport or game, right, yep, will have no moral qualms about taking advantage of those rules. Yep. With that said, I'm going to have a performance-enhancing drug called lunch.
Likewise, Nate. Let's both go enhance our performance by food. Let us know what you think of the show. Reach out to us at riskybusiness@pushkin.fm. Risky Business is hosted by me, Maria Konnikova.
And by me, Nate Silver. The show is a co-production of Pushkin Industries and iHeartMedia. This episode was produced by Isaac Carter. Our associate producer is Sonia Gerwitt. Lydia Jean Cott and Daphne Chen are our editors, and our executive producer is Jacob Goldstein. Mixing by Sarah Bruguer.
If you like this show, please rate and review us so other people can find us too. But once again, only if you like us. We don't want those bad reviews out there. Thanks for tuning in.